Hey everyone, what's the most creative and legal revenge you can think of for this situation? Pitch it below. All right, time for the story. I didn't look up when they entered the garage. Didn't need to. The sound of boots on concrete, the awkward shuffle of rookies, the loud, insistent laugh of Greg. His laugh had always been obnoxious, but today it had a sharp edge. Look at this place, Greg said, his voice carrying. What's this? A museum for out-of-date equipment? Come on, Sandra, you don't belong here. He had two rookies with him, both looking at me like I was some kind of zoo exhibit. One of them laughed, elbowing the other in the ribs. I kept my focus on the ballistic panel in front of me, scrubbing at the grime. I wasn't here for their amusement. Greg stepped closer, making sure they all had a front row seat to whatever performance he thought was about to unfold. You really think you're gonna fix this place up with your, what is it? Your fancy science skills? I didn't look at him, just kept my hand steady on the panel, moving the cloth with precision. If he wanted a reaction, he wasn't going to get one. Then Captain Ford walked in, the quiet authority of his presence cutting through the room. The rookies instantly shut up, straightening their posture. Ford's eyes flicked to my workbench, to the small service pin that had slipped out of my sleeve, barely visible. It was the only thing on me that still had any shine. He nodded slowly, recognizing it for what it was. Sandra Lynn, he said, voice steady. You were the lead analyst on the Daniels case, the high-profile one. There was a moment of stillness. Greg froze. The rookies went quiet, exchanging uncertain glances. Ford stepped closer, saluting me with the sort of respect people only give to someone who's seen things they'd never want to. I didn't flinch, didn't give him anything more than a small nod. Legends survive because they do the small things right, I said, my voice low. Not the flashy stuff, the details. Ford's salute lingered for a beat too long. The room felt heavier now, quieter. Greg cleared his throat, but his words didn't carry the same sting. Let's move along, Ford said, his tone shifting the mood. The rookies filed out, their whispers gone. Greg lingered, staring at me like he was waiting for me to break. I didn't. I just picked up the disassembled ballistic panel again and went back to work. The sound of Greg's footsteps still echoed in my mind as I continued working on the panel. I didn't need to look up again, didn't need to let anyone see how it still landed, how it still stung. But as I wiped away another layer of dust, something about the quiet in the room reminded me of a different kind of stillness. It wasn't the peace of calm, though. It was the kind of stillness that felt like a trap. The memory hit hard. A year ago, my father's memorial. I had been prepared for it. Lena, my sister, had always been the type to make a scene, the kind of person who thrived on drama. But this time, she'd taken it too far. She was going to make me break down in front of everyone, make me crumble into a sobbing mess for her audience. She'd always thought grief was a performance, a public thing. I remember sitting there in the back of that church, feeling the weight of the crowd's eyes on me. People I hadn't seen in years. Eyes that didn't care about me or Dad, just wanted something to talk about afterward. Lena wasn't subtle about it. I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. Orchid. It was the word that told me everything I needed to know. My husband, Tom, had already seen it. He'd seen the cameras Lena had hidden, the ones that were going to catch me looking weak, the ones that were going to capture a breakdown she could replay for months. He'd already sent word to the marshals. And then they moved. Quietly, as mourners, blending in, taking their spots around the room. They were the shadows in the background, the ones nobody noticed until they were needed. I was supposed to react, to rise to the bait and give Lena what she wanted. But I didn't. I stayed still. Calm, collected. Lena had a plan, but I had one too. When she started making her move, walking toward me with that look in her eyes, I didn't flinch. I didn't stand. I just kept my hands folded in my lap, my face neutral. I could feel the weight of everyone waiting for me to crack. The cameras were there, hidden in plain sight, ready to catch me at my lowest. She got close. Her voice was soft, the kind of condescending sweetness that made me sick. Are you okay, Sandra? You really should let it out. You're gonna need to process this. I didn't respond. Didn't even blink. I knew exactly what she was doing. But I also knew that I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me in pieces. And then it happened. Lena paused, her gaze flicking behind me. She wasn't the only one who noticed the shift in the room. The marshals were in place, subtle, invisible to the crowd, and suddenly Lena saw them too. The game changed. She hesitated. I didn't give her a chance to recover. I stood up, adjusted my dress like it was just another day. I walked past her with deliberate steps, feeling every one of the marshals around me, but never acknowledging them. I walked right past her. The game was over before it had begun. Lena's trap had no teeth when she couldn't get the reaction she'd expected. The cameras caught nothing of note, nothing but an unflinching woman keeping her face steady. I blinked, shaking the memory off as the sound of the garage faded back in. The rookies were gone. The room was empty now, except for me and the work I still had to finish. That moment in the church, though, it stuck with me. It was a lesson. Never give people what they want when it's not real. Don't play their game. The same calm, the same control. It was here now, in this garage, in the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights. I glanced at the pin again, half hidden on my sleeve. Let them draw whatever conclusions they wanted from it. I didn't care. I wasn't going to perform for anyone. The only thing that mattered was getting the job done. And I wasn't about to break now. The fluorescent lights hummed in the hallway as I made my way to Captain Ford's office. The air smelled of radiator fluid and burnt coffee, the kind of stale, industrial scent that clung to everything around here. I stood in front of his door for a second, bracing myself. I didn't know what he wanted, but I'd learned long ago that Ford didn't waste time. I knocked once and entered without waiting for permission. He was at his desk, head down, looking over a stack of paperwork. The office was small, cluttered, but organized in its own way. A map of the state hung on the wall, pins marking locations. The space felt like it was meant for action, not talk. Ford didn't look up immediately, just muttered, "Close the door." I did. He finally glanced at me, his eyes narrowing. "Why is someone with your background running diagnostics in a back lot?" I didn't flinch. His tone wasn't accusatory, not exactly, but there was a certain weight to the question. I could feel the gears in his head turning. He was trying to figure out why someone like me, someone with a record of high-profile cases, was buried in something so mundane. I pulled a chair out, took a seat, and leaned back slightly, trying to keep things casual. "I'm embedded with internal affairs," I said, voice steady. "State-level investigation. We're tracking a data breach." Ford's brow furrowed, his gaze sharpening. "A data breach?" "Yeah," I said, taking a breath. "It's tied to a new firmware update being used in the vehicle tracking systems. Patrol cars specifically. There's a security hole and someone's exploiting it. My role in this? I've got access to maintenance logs where the firmware updates are being laundered." Ford's eyes didn't leave mine. He was quiet for a moment, processing the information. I could tell he was trying to connect the dots, figure out why this all mattered to him, why he mattered. "The updates are being manipulated?" he asked. I nodded. "Some of them, yes. They're being swapped with tampered versions, but it's clean on the surface. Nothing looks out of place unless you really dig into the logs." "So, you're telling me this garage is a point of access for this?" Ford asked, his voice low, like he was testing my theory. "That's one of the touch points," I said. "It's too quiet here, too much routine. It's perfect for moving things around under the radar. I've traced a couple of anomalies back here already." Ford leaned back in his chair, folding his arms, his jaw tightened, like he wasn't sure whether to trust me or not. I could see him weighing his options, making sure I wasn't about to drag him into something bigger than he was prepared for. "You think this is more than just a data breach?" he asked. I hesitated for a second. "I think it's tied to a forgery ring. The breach is just a small piece. Whoever's behind this is using the vehicle system as a cover to move other illegal goods. That's what I suspect." Ford didn't respond right away. He just stared at me, like he was trying to figure out if I was bluffing, if I was overstating it. His eyes didn't flicker, though, and I knew then that I wasn't getting through to him just by talking. If I wanted his full attention, I'd need something more than words. "Look, Captain," I said, leaning forward slightly, "I didn't come here to waste your time. I'm not interested in blowing this thing up, but I am telling you that this garage is tied into a much bigger picture than we thought." Ford's gaze softened a little, but the suspicion didn't leave his eyes. "And why are you still working in the back lot?" I didn't blink. "Because it's where the records are, and I'm the one with access." His mouth tightened, the question unspoken hanging between us. If I had answers, I'd give them. But the rest of the picture wasn't clear yet. All I had were pieces. I couldn't afford to share everything until I knew more. He finally nodded, slow and deliberate. "Keep me updated. I'll let you know if I can help you push this further." I stood up, my chair scraping across the floor. "I will. Thanks, Captain." Ford didn't stand, but he gave me a small nod as I walked toward the door. Before I left, I paused for a second, looking back at him. "You know," I said, You wouldn't be the first person to look the other way if this goes further than expected. Ford met my eyes, his expression unreadable. And you wouldn't be the first to see it through. I walked out, closing the door quietly behind me, already planning my next move. I sat at my desk in the back office, the hum of the garage still lingering in the air. The dim light from the single overhead bulb cast shadows across the clutter of files, diagnostic reports, and maintenance logs scattered around me. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but my mind wasn't on the work in front of me. It was elsewhere, 18 months ago to be exact. I could still see the picture clearly, the grainy image that arrived in my inbox without warning. The first thing I'd noticed was the engine control unit, ECU, in the hands of someone who definitely wasn't supposed to have it. State-issued, U.S. software identifiers, the kind of high-tech, encrypted equipment that had no place outside of authorized hands. The ECU wasn't just any piece of equipment, it was a key component in the new fleet's software, tracking and controlling patrol cars, tying them to a bigger system. My immediate thought was, how did it get there? I zoomed in on the image, examining the details. The unmarked truck, the faded uniforms of the men unloading the stolen gear, and the unmistakable logo on the side of the shipping crate. I didn't recognize the language on the boxes, but the structure of the operation screamed smuggling. The photo's metadata showed the location, overseas, some remote port. That wasn't the kicker, though. It was the routing data embedded in the photo file. I ran it through the software I kept on hand, checking the coordinates against known shipping routes, and there it was. The routing path didn't match. My brother's division was listed right in the middle of it. Greg. I didn't say anything to anyone, not right away. It was a needle in a haystack, one that could be ignored if you didn't know how to look, but I couldn't unsee it. Not after everything I knew, everything I'd seen over the years. I logged it. Just that. Nothing more. No accusations. I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. The following weeks were a blur. Too much routine, too many briefings, too many days spent pushing paper for the force. I requested recertification, went civilian. They didn't know what I was really doing. I wasn't just running diagnostics or scanning logs. I was embedded. The internal investigation had just started, but it wasn't until months later that I began seeing patterns, discrepancies, time drifts, mismatched receipts, manipulated VIN scans, small anomalies at first, things that could have been explained away by human error or routine mistakes. But the more I looked, the more it added up. I followed the trail of irregularities, tracking them through maintenance logs, shipping manifests, and inventory systems. I kept quiet about it all, stayed in the background, working quietly. In the beginning, it was just a hunch, a nagging feeling. But slowly, the pieces began to fit together. The local breach, the one that ran through the garage, wasn't random. It was deliberate. Whoever was behind it knew how to cover their tracks, but they couldn't cover everything. They'd missed something. My brother's name popped up again. And again. I traced every delivery, every misfiled receipt, every manipulated record to one location. This garage. The same garage where I work now. The more I mapped it, the clearer it became. The routing anomalies were leading me straight to this place. I could feel the weight of it building. Greg's division was at the heart of it, whether he knew it or not. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think that my own brother was tangled up in something this far-reaching. But the facts were there, the evidence didn't lie. And so here I was, in the very garage I had once hoped to stay far away from, embedded deep within the system, tracking every glitch, every oversight, every breadcrumb. This place, where the lines between the law and something much worse had been blurred, was ground zero. The trap was closing in, and I wasn't backing down. I let out a long breath and rubbed my eyes, feeling the weight of the situation pressing in on me. But there was no room for hesitation, no room for doubt. Not anymore. I glanced at the clock on the wall, trying to center myself. There were no shortcuts here. It would take time, but I was going to finish this. Every irregularity had its source, and I was going to find it. With a steady hand, I pulled up another log entry and began sifting through it. Another day, another clue. There were pieces to put together, and I was getting closer. I was still running through the logs when I saw him, the familiar shape of Greg rounding the corner of the supply cage. I could feel the tension in the air even before he opened his mouth. He hadn't seen me yet, but I knew he would. It was the kind of thing that always seemed to happen. He stopped just a few feet away from me, eyes narrowing when he realized I was there. His usual swagger was gone now, replaced with a sharp edge, the kind of energy that had always come with him when he was feeling threatened. "You're still here," he said, the words cold. "Thought you'd be long gone by now. Guess I was wrong." I didn't answer. I just watched him, trying to keep the calm I'd been carrying since the moment I stepped into this place. His eyes shifted, scanning the cluttered area behind me. But he knew. He knew exactly what I was doing here. "You've got a lot of nerve, Sandra," he said, his voice low. "You really think you can just waltz back in after what happened? Mess with my operation?" His hand brushed across the stack of spare parts as if to emphasize the his in his statement. I straightened, forcing myself to look him in the eye. "I'm not messing with anything, Greg. I'm doing my job, something you should have learned how to do a long time ago." He took a step closer, his jaw tight. "Don't start with me. You ruined my promotion years ago, over some minor security breach?" His voice dripped with resentment. "I never forgave you for that. I could feel the sting of it, even though I'd heard it 100 times. But I wouldn't let it show. Not now. Not here. You bypassed vehicle intake procedures," I said, my voice steady, even as the weight of the memory hit me. "You didn't follow protocol, and I told the truth. That's not my fault." Greg's face twisted. "You cost me everything, Sandra. You think you're better than me because you've got some fancy title or badge? You think you're above all this?" I held my ground, my hands folded in front of me. "I'm exactly where I belong, Greg. You should have followed the rules, but you didn't. And now you're trying to make it everyone else's problem." He stepped back, his eyes flashing with anger. For a moment, it felt like the entire space between us cracked open. There was too much history here, too much unfinished between us, things we'd never said out loud, never dealt with. "You've always been so perfect," Greg spat. "Always the good little soldier, never took a risk, always had to be the righteous one." His voice shook with barely contained fury. "You just don't get it, do you? I did what I had to do. This job isn't about following every stupid rule. It's about getting results." "Results?" I repeated, my voice quiet but sharp. "You mean cutting corners and hurting people to get ahead? That's not what this job is about, Greg. That's not what any job is about." His face reddened. He leaned in, his breath heavy with anger. "You stay out of my lane, Sandra. I'm serious. You don't know what you're messing with." I didn't flinch. "This is my lane now, Greg," I said, keeping my voice low, controlled. "You're not the only one who can see things for what they are. So whatever mess you've got going on here, it's coming to an end. You can walk away from it, or you can stay and get burned. Your choice." For a long moment, neither of us moved. It was like we were both holding our breath, waiting for something to break. But then Greg turned his back to me, his steps heavy as he started to walk away. "You'll regret this," he muttered, not looking back. I watched him go, the weight of everything hanging between us like a suffocating cloud. It was over. There was no fixing it now, no salvaging what was left. That had been clear for a long time. As he disappeared into the shadows of the garage, I took a slow breath. The space between us was too wide now. I couldn't fix it. I wasn't sure I ever wanted to. I didn't need to chase after him. Instead, I turned back to the supply cage. The task in front of me was clear now. I wasn't just dealing with a data breach or a forger's ring. I was dealing with family, my family. And I'd long since given up hope of things ever being different. I made a mental note of the spot where he'd walked off, where we'd exchanged those bitter words. It was more than just a corner of the garage. It marked the end of something that had been broken for a long time. And now I'd marked it. The map in my head was clearer than ever. There was no going back. The garage was quiet by the time I got back to my office. The hum of the fluorescent lights above was the only sound, the kind of noise that made everything feel just a little too empty. I pulled up the security footage, knowing what I'd be looking for. I'd expected Greg to be careful. I expected him to hide whatever he was doing. But he wasn't. I watched as he moved through the garage, his usual cocky stride softened tonight, like he knew something was about to happen. It was late, too late to be doing anything but clearing out. But then, just before the shift change, I saw him. He stopped by the maintenance bay, looking over his shoulder like he was checking for anyone who might be watching. The camera angles weren't perfect, but they were good enough. I zoomed in on his hand, the black USB drive slipping into the palm of his hand. The man who took it didn't look like he belonged here. Too old for a rookie, too scruffy for anyone in a uniform. He wore a faded work jacket with no visible ID badge. Exactly the kind of person you'd expect if you were trying to move something under the radar. I froze the footage. My stomach turned. This wasn't just some sloppy exchange. This was deliberate. Greg handed the USB to him with a little too much familiarity. The man took it without hesitation, slipping it into his own jacket pocket. No words, no nothing. I saved the stills and logged the evidence carefully. I could feel the weight of it in my chest, but I wasn't ready to send it through yet. This wasn't the final proof. Not yet. Not until I knew more. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. I wasn't going to act without making sure I had a solid plan. I needed confirmation. I needed a way to trap whoever was pulling the strings. I picked up my phone and dialed the number I hadn't used in months. Clark answered on the second ring. Sandra, his voice was gravelly, like he'd just woken up. What's going on? I kept it brief. Got something. I need your help. Clark was a former mentor, one of the few people in this world I trusted implicitly. He'd been with cyber enforcement before it even had a name. I knew that whatever was happening here, he'd been through something similar. What do you have? He asked, his tone shifting immediately into professional mode. Greg's involved, but I need to confirm what's really going on before I do anything, I said. I've got a USB exchange on camera. The guy Greg handed it off to is clean. I don't know who he is, but he's got something on him that shouldn't be there. Sounds like the right setup, Clark replied. What do you want from me? I need to bait him out, a falsified firmware update. Something realistic enough to get their attention, but not too obvious, I said, rubbing my eyes. I need a beacon code in the file, one that will ping us once it's activated. There was a pause on the other end of the line. You're putting a lot of trust in a decoy file. I don't have any other options, I answered, a little more sharply than I meant to. This garage is a mess, Clark. It's not just Greg. It's bigger than that. We need to see if this goes all the way to the top. He didn't respond right away. I could hear him typing on his end, probably running through possibilities in his head. Then, his voice came through again, calm as always. Okay, I'll generate the update file. Make sure it looks legit, just like the real one. I'll add the beacon code. He paused like he was considering his next words. We'll need to run it through the same channels the real updates use. If this guy's as deep in the system as I think, he'll know something's off if we don't make it match. I'll take care of that, I said. I'll log it through the regular process. Same routine, same paperwork. If he's in on this, he'll bite. And if he does, we'll be ready to move. Clark hummed in agreement. I'll have the file ready in an hour. Once it's out there, you'll need to be ready for anything. Don't push it too hard. I nodded, even though I knew he couldn't see me. I'm not in this to make a scene. I just need answers. We hung up, and I stared at the screen, watching the replay of Greg handing off the USB. The footage was clearer now, the weight of it sitting heavy on my chest. I had to stay sharp. One misstep, and it could blow up in my face. I pulled up the maintenance logs, double-checking the process for firmware updates, making sure everything looked clean. I didn't take shortcuts. I couldn't afford to. A few minutes later, I had everything I needed. The falsified update file was ready to go, the beacon code hidden inside, waiting to trigger. It was going to look just like another routine update. If anyone was paying attention, really paying attention, they'd spot the subtle difference, the one thing that would tell them the file wasn't what it appeared to be. I logged it all through the same routine system I'd used for the real updates. Everything had to match perfectly. If I did it right, Greg and his new friend wouldn't know what hit them until the beacon pinged. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. The next step would come soon, and I needed to be ready. The night had fallen quiet again. The only thing that moved in the garage was the steady shuffle of paperwork, and now the decoy file I'd prepared was part of it. I watched from the shadows, my eyes on the desk where the maintenance logs were piling up. I knew exactly where it was headed, how it would move through the system, and I knew Greg wouldn't hesitate to grab it, not when it looked like just another routine update. My phone buzzed, a quiet vibration against my leg. I didn't check it immediately. I didn't need to. I could feel the tension building, the moment stretching out like the calm before a storm. The file was moving, just like I'd expected. And then, ping. The beacon lit up on my phone screen. I stood slowly, my pulse quickening. I took a breath, focused, and started moving toward the back of the garage. No sudden steps, no hurrying. I had to be invisible now. I tracked Greg through the shadows, careful to stay out of sight, making sure he didn't catch on that anything was off. He was just a few feet ahead, his posture stiff, as he went through the motions of his usual shift change. He picked up the folder with the decoy file without hesitation, his hands moving fast like he'd been waiting for this moment. I followed him down the hallway, keeping a safe distance. The building was quieter now, the buzz of activity nearly non existent. It was the perfect time for someone like Greg to make a move. He turned a corner and I followed, keeping my movements measured. I knew exactly where he was heading. The emissions testing bay, a forgotten part of the garage that hadn't seen use in months, perfectly isolated, no cameras. I slipped into the shadows of the bay, the dim light casting long, distorted shapes along the walls. Greg was there already, waiting. The same man from the footage, the one in the faded jacket, was standing with his back to the door, waiting for him. There was a moment, just a split second, where they exchanged nothing but a look. Greg handed over the folder, the one containing the decoy file, and the man slid it into his own hands like it was something delicate, something valuable. I couldn't make out their words, but I didn't need to. I knew what was happening. The man pulled out a laptop, setting it down on a nearby counter, his fingers already working the keys. Greg watched, his face a mixture of impatience and expectation. They were too focused on the task at hand to notice the faint rustling of the air around them, and then, ping, the beacon activated again. I didn't hesitate. I pulled out my phone and dialed Clark. His voice answered almost immediately. "Move," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Now." I didn't wait for him to respond. I knew what he was doing on his end, coordinating with OSI, making sure everything was in place. The moment stretched, and then the silence shattered. Unmarked vehicles rolled in outside the bay, so quiet that you could have missed them if you weren't paying attention. But I was paying attention. I watched as agents flooded in, moving fast, efficient. They were in position. No words, no noise. Just the rapid, controlled motions of professionals who'd done this 100 times before. Greg's face shifted in an instant, from focused to confused to outright stunned, as the agents flooded in behind him. The man in the faded jacket looked up, his expression just as shocked, his hands frozen in the act of plugging the laptop in. In a flash, the agents closed in, surrounding both of them with a speed that left no room for escape. Greg's eyes met mine, his mouth falling open as if the reality of it hadn't quite hit him. He looked caught, his entire body frozen. For a brief second, I almost felt sorry for him. But that passed quickly. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. There was nothing left to say. Greg opened his mouth like he was about to speak, but one of the agents cut him off, pulling his arms behind his back and snapping handcuffs into place. The man in the faded jacket wasn't far behind, his hands quickly bound as well. It was over. Quietly, swiftly. I stayed where I was, standing off to the side. I didn't need to make this personal. Not anymore. The agent in charge looked over at me, nodding once, his eyes acknowledging the work I'd done to bring them here. But there was no need for words. This wasn't about recognition. It was about getting the job done. As the two men were escorted out of the bay, I let my shoulders relax. I felt a weight lift, one that had been hanging over me for months. But the thing about moments like this, they never feel as satisfying as you expect them to. There's no real relief when everything you've worked for finally clicks into place. All I had now was what was left. I pulled my phone from my pocket and stared at the still image of Greg handing over the USB, saved for my own record. It wasn't over yet. This was just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. But tonight, I'd made sure that the first pieces had fallen into place, and that was enough. For now, the holding room was colder than I expected, the sterile white walls reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting. I stood behind the one-way glass, watching Greg, who sat on the other side with his hands cuffed to the table. His face was pale, his eyes darting around the room, the tension in his shoulders obvious even from this distance. The agents were already in position, one sitting across from him, the other standing by the door. They had the files spread out in front of him, logs, photos, financial statements, everything. They'd been at this for a while now. Greg didn't speak at first, just sat there, eyes flicking nervously to the documents on the table. Then, the agent across from him slid a few photos in front of him, clear shots of the USB transfer, the man in the faded jacket, all of it. "Recognize anyone?" the agent asked, his voice even. Greg didn't flinch. "I thought the software was being tested," he said, the words coming out too quickly, like he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. The agent didn't react. He just pushed the financials forward, letting them speak for themselves. The numbers were damning. They showed the illegal transactions, the laundered payments, the backdoor deals. All of it traced directly to Greg. "Testing?" the agent repeated, his voice harder now. "You're telling me that's your excuse for handing over stolen property?" Greg's jaw clenched, but he didn't say anything. His eyes shifted toward the one-way glass, and I knew he was trying to spot me in the reflection. He didn't. He never did. I stood there, hands folded, watching him squirm, and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no relief. Just the familiar weight of a job well done. The agent pushed the photos closer, his voice rising a little. "We've got a lot more than just these pictures, Greg. A lot more. You can make this easier on yourself." Greg finally looked back down at the table, his hands shaking slightly. He inhaled deeply, a shaky breath that betrayed his calm facade. His eyes darted to the door like he was considering his next move. The silence stretched, and I knew he was coming to a decision. Finally, he spoke. "I want my lawyer." The words were flat, resigned. He wasn't getting out of this. He knew that now. The agent didn't say anything, just stood up, motioning for the other agent to step forward. The door clicked open, and Greg was escorted out, his cuffs jangling with each step. I didn't watch them take him away. I didn't need to. I turned and walked out of the observation room, my footsteps echoing through the hallway. Clark was already waiting for me in the adjacent office, leaning against the door frame with his arms crossed. His eyes were calculating, but he gave me a nod as I entered. Ford was there too, sitting at the desk, looking more worn down than usual. The air was thick with the scent of old coffee and something heavier, like bad news. "You did good," Clark said, his voice quieter than usual. "But this isn't over." I didn't need him to tell me that. I could already feel the weight of the fallout starting to build. Ford looked up from his paperwork, his eyes narrowing as he studied me. "You've made enemies, Sandra," he said, his tone low, measured. "Expect fallout. People won't take kindly to what you've done." I didn't say anything. I wasn't surprised. This was the cost of doing what was right. I'd known it would come with consequences. What I hadn't expected was the way the rumors were already beginning to ripple through the garage. Some people saw me as a hero, the one who uncovered the breach, the one who did what had to be done. Others, not so much. "I don't care what they think," I said, keeping my voice even. "I care about the job." Ford and Clark exchanged a look, but neither of them pushed it. Clark finally spoke up again, his voice lower than before. "Just be prepared," he said. "Things are going to get ugly in here. Some people won't see you as an ally anymore." I nodded. I'd expected that too. The garage wasn't a place for loyalty, not when the stakes were this high. It was a place where people looked out for themselves first, and I'd just turned a lot of people against me. Ford pushed a few papers across the desk, his face grim. "We're gonna need you to lay low for a while. Stay focused on the task. There's more to this than just Greg." I didn't argue. He was right. This was bigger than one person, one betrayal. There was still the bigger picture, the forgery ring, the data breach, the people still out there. And I couldn't afford to lose sight of it. But as I turned to leave, the weight of the situation settled more firmly on my shoulders. The job wasn't over, not yet. And as the rumors swirled around me, I couldn't help but wonder what was going to happen next. I wasn't afraid of the fallout, but I wasn't sure I was ready for what was coming after either. The letter came one morning, shoved through the small slot in my office door. It wasn't addressed to me, just dropped there like any other piece of mail, nothing special. But the handwriting was unmistakable. I didn't open it right away. I left it on the edge of my desk, the way you might leave a reminder that you're not ready to deal with yet. But eventually, after hours spent running logs and checking maintenance reports, I picked it up. I held it between my fingers for a moment, the weight of it somehow heavier than I expected. Greg's handwriting was neat but rough around the edges, like he was trying to hide something, maybe even from himself. I unfolded the paper slowly, reading the words that were simple and to the point. "I'll think about what you said." That was it. No apology, no acknowledgement of what had happened. Just those few words, a cold, detached recognition. The kind of response that didn't even try to make things right, but at least didn't try to make them worse. I folded the letter again, then slid it into the small tin I kept in the bottom drawer of my desk. The tin was full of things. Photos from old cases, a patch from an operation years ago, small mementos of things I hadn't let go of, memories that no longer had a place anywhere else. I didn't need to keep them, but I did. The letter didn't change anything. But it meant something, even if I couldn't say what exactly. I closed the drawer and went back to my work. Weeks passed. The garage had settled into a new kind of rhythm. The chaos from the investigation had died down, replaced by a quiet respect that lingered in the background. People didn't talk about me much anymore, and I didn't expect them to. But the shift was there. The whispers had died, replaced with the kind of unspoken acknowledgement that came from people seeing you do your job and doing it well. I wasn't a hero to anyone. I didn't need to be, but I'd earned something back. One afternoon, Captain Ford called me into his office. I knocked once before stepping in, and he didn't look up right away. He was reviewing some paperwork, but when he did glance over, I could see the faintest glimmer of something else in his eyes. Not approval, exactly, but something like it. "You've made your peace with the fallout?" he asked, setting the papers down. His voice was low, like he was testing my response. I didn't hesitate. "I've made peace with the work." Ford didn't smile, but he nodded slowly, his eyes flicking to the small stack of files on his desk. "That's what matters. The rest of it? Well, that comes and goes. People change quietly, Sandra. Not in speeches, not in grand gestures. Change happens through maintenance, day by day, log by log." I nodded, not just in agreement, but in understanding. He wasn't wrong. That's how real change happened. It wasn't a loud shift. It was a steady hand on the wheel, keeping the course true. As I stood to leave, I felt the weight of it settle over me. The quietness in the garage wasn't just a result of the case being over. It was something more, a shift in the air, in the way things worked, in the way people looked at me, maybe even respected me. Not as a figurehead, but as someone who did what had to be done. No more, no less. The next day, a young trainee, one of the rookies who'd been laughing behind my back months ago, came over to my workbench. He had a clipboard in his hands, but there was something else in his eyes. Curiosity, maybe even respect. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Do people change?" he asked, his voice careful, like he wasn't sure how I'd react. I didn't look up at first, just focused on the tools in my hands. The work didn't stop, even for questions like these. I set the wrench down and glanced at him. "Yeah, people change," I said, my voice steady. "But it's not quick. It's not flashy. It's about logging the work, staying honest, staying consistent." He nodded, clearly thinking it over. He didn't say anything else, just turned and walked back to his own station. I watched him for a moment, and then my eyes fell to the sleeve of my shirt. The service pin that had once been hidden beneath my sleeve, earned, worn proudly in the past, was tucked back underneath it. Not for anyone else, but for me. To remind myself that the work was never finished. You just kept going. One step at a time. The garage hummed around me, the rhythm of tools, engines, and maintenance reports. The quiet was different now, not like it was before, full of mockery or gossip, but a new kind of quiet. One where respect had replaced suspicion, where people just did the job. And I was part of that. Maybe change didn't have to be big or loud. Maybe it only mattered when it was steady, when it was real. I finished the last of the maintenance checks on the new patrol car unit just as the clock crept toward closing time. The hum of the engine sounded clean, steady, a far cry from the wrecks that had come through here months ago. There was something almost calming about the precision of it, the way the bolts clicked into place, the way the systems all lined up perfectly. I wiped my hands on the rag and gave the car one last once-over. It was done. Not just the car, but the work too. It felt like everything had come full circle. Maybe that's how things worked around here. Things didn't change overnight, but they did change. Slowly, quietly, like the steady rhythm of a well-oiled machine. Ford walked into the bay just as I was about to sign off the last of the logs. He held a folder in his hand, the edges crinkled from age, but his expression was as neutral as ever. He stopped by my workbench, nodded at the car, and handed me the folder. I looked up at him, raising an eyebrow. "What's this?" "Your new commendation," Ford said, his voice low, measured. "The same one they took from you." I took the folder from him, opening it without any expectation. But there it was, the same commendation they'd stripped from me months ago. Now back in my hands, quietly returned. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. I set it down on the workbench, beside the old one I kept hidden in the bottom of my locker. Ford didn't stay long. He just gave me a nod, the kind of nod that said he wasn't here for a conversation. He turned and walked out, the soft sound of his boots fading as the garage settled back into its usual rhythm. A young tech walked by a few minutes later, holding out a sandwich without a word. He didn't look at me, just handed it over like it was the most normal thing in the world. I took it, nodding my thanks. He gave a slight jerk of his head and kept walking, as if offering a sandwich was the most natural way to acknowledge someone's presence. I didn't mind. There were no words needed anymore. I didn't need his praise. I didn't need anyone's validation. I just needed to keep doing the work. I ran one last systems test on the patrol car, checking the diagnostics one final time. It was all green. Everything was functional, the software running smoothly. I signed off on the paperwork, each word feeling like it belonged there. It was done. Another shift. Another job well done. The garage lights flickered overhead as night crept in, the air growing cooler. I placed the clipboard back in its holder, tucked the commendation into my locker beside the old one, and turned to face the garage. I was ready for tomorrow. Ready for whatever came next. It wasn't about the recognition or the pats on the back. It was about the quiet, steady work. The truth. The machine would always tell the truth, if you listened closely enough. And I planned to listen. I stood there, just for a moment, feeling the weight of the silence, the weight of the responsibility. And as the night closed in, I knew that when morning came, I'd be ready for the next choice, the next challenge, the next machine.